$13.3 billion. That is the price tag on the USS Gerald R. Ford, the most expensive warship ever built. One ship, $13.3 billion. And it still does not work the way it was supposed to. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, China just commissioned its third aircraft carrier, completed sea trials on its fourth, and announced a fifth, all for less than the cost of the Ford alone. Pentagon analysts ran the numbers in early 2026. The conclusion was classified, then it leaked. And the math it contained was the kind that makes admirals lose sleep. For the price of one Ford-class supercarrier, China can build and operate 7 flat tops. 7. Not 7 inferior ships. 7 aircraft carriers with conventional catapults, proven propulsion systems, and air wings that are growing more capable every 18 months. 7 flight decks. 7 radar signatures to track. 7 targets an adversary has to find, fix, and neutralize in a conflict that Pentagon war games say will be decided in the first 72 hours. The United States Navy has 2 Ford-class carriers. The third is not even halfway built. The fourth is a line item in a budget Congress has not approved. Here is the detail that makes this strange. The debate inside the Pentagon is no longer about whether the Ford class has problems. Everyone agrees it has problems. The debate is whether the Ford class is the right answer to the question the Navy is actually being asked. That question is not, can we build the most advanced carrier ever? The question is, can we win a war in the Western Pacific against a Navy that is now the largest in the world by hull count? Let us look at the math. The Gerald R. Ford was designed to be a generational leap, not an incremental upgrade from the Nimitz class, a full departure. The Navy wanted 3 things at once. First, an electromagnetic launch system called EMALS to replace the old steam catapults. Second, an advanced weapons elevator system called AWE to move ordnance from the magazines to the flight deck faster than any carrier in history. Third, a new reactor design, the A1B, that would generate 3 times the electrical power of a Nimitz-class reactor, enough to support future weapons like directed energy systems and electromagnetic railguns. On paper, this was the carrier that would dominate the next 50 years of naval warfare. The ship that would render every other flat top on the planet obsolete, on paper. In practice, the electromagnetic catapult suffered reliability failures that grounded aircraft during the Ford's first deployment. The system was designed to launch aircraft 4,166 times between critical failures. During initial testing, it failed every 400 launches. That is a 10-fold gap between specification and reality. One detail that stuck with me from the classified review, the EMALS system requires software patches so frequently that the crew started calling the maintenance cycle the daily prayer. The advanced weapons elevators were worse. The Ford was delivered with 0 of its 11 weapons elevators operational. 0. On a warship whose entire combat logic depends on moving bombs and missiles from deep inside the hull to the flight deck in minutes, not one elevator worked on delivery day. By 2025, most had been brought online. But most is not all. And the maintenance burden on the ones that do work has been significant. We showed you the Ford's first combat deployment in an earlier video. What we showed you was the air wing launching strikes. What we did not show you was the engineering department working around the clock to keep systems running that were never supposed to need that level of intervention on a vessel this new. Here is the equation the leaked Pentagon review put on the table. The total Ford-class program, 4 ships, has ballooned past $58 billion. That is not a rounding error. That is the entire annual defense budget of most NATO allies. For 4 ships, now run the attrition math. In a peer conflict against China, Pentagon war games consistently show that the United States loses 1 to 2 carriers in the opening phase. not because the carrier is weak, because the carrier is the single highest value target in the theater. And China has spent 30 years building an entire kill chain. The DF-21D, the DF-26, the YJ-21 hypersonic anti-ship missile, designed to do exactly one thing: put a hole in a supercarrier flight deck. If you lose one Ford-class carrier, you have lost $13.3 billion, 5,000 sailors, and an air wing of 75 aircraft in a single strike. You have also lost something the Pentagon cannot buy back: time. The Ford class takes 7 years to build. China commissions a new carrier every 18 months. That is not a list of problems. That is a pattern. The pattern: the United States is building fewer, more expensive, more complex ships, and each one takes longer to construct, longer to certify, and longer to repair. The adversary is building more ships, simpler ships, faster ships. In a war of attrition, which is what a Western Pacific conflict becomes after week 1, the side that can replace losses faster has a structural advantage that no single piece of technology can overcome. Type equation. In the comments, if that math changed how you see this debate now. Here is the part that does not make sense on the surface. If the Ford class is so troubled, why do some of the most experienced admirals in the United States Navy still argue it is irreplaceable? Because they are not wrong. They are just answering a different question. The Ford class does something no other ship on Earth can do. It generates over 300 megawatts of electrical power, 3 times what a Nimitz produces. That power is not a luxury. It is the foundation for every weapon system the Navy wants to deploy in the 2030s and 2040s. Directed energy weapons that can neutralize incoming missiles at the speed of light for pennies per shot, instead of millions per interceptor. Electromagnetic railguns that can fire projectiles at Mach 7 with no propellant, no warhead, just kinetic energy, turning the cost asymmetry equation around. The admirals who defend the Ford are not defending the ship as it exists today. They are defending the ship as it will exist in 15 years. A floating power plant feeding a generation of weapons the enemy cannot afford to counter. Here is the detail that makes their argument land. Remember the cost asymmetry equation we started with? An SM-6 interceptor costs $5.3 million. A Chinese anti-ship cruise missile costs roughly $2 million. Fire enough missiles, and you drain the magazine. That equation favors the attacker. A directed energy weapon changes the variable. The cost per engagement drops from $5.3 million to approximately $10 of electricity. $10. At that price, you do not run out of ammunition. You run out of targets. The equation flips. The Ford's reactor is the only shipboard power plant in the world with enough capacity to run those systems at full power while simultaneously launching and recovering a full air wing. That is not a limitation. That is an advantage. But only if you survive long enough to install the weapons. And that is the fracture point inside the Pentagon. The technologists say, give us 10 more years, and the Ford becomes the most dominant warship ever built. The strategists say, we may not have 10 years. China is not waiting. China is building now. Subscribe to Navy Combat USA. We do not celebrate weapons. We calculate whether they work. Let us look at the other side of the Pacific and examine what China is actually building. Because the answer is more sophisticated than most analysts acknowledge. The Type 003 Fujian is not a copy of an American supercarrier. It is an answer to a specific strategic problem. China does not need to project power across 2 oceans. It needs to project power across one body of water, the Western Pacific, specifically across the Taiwan Strait, the South China Sea, and the First Island Chain. The operational radius is measured in hundreds of miles, not thousands. That changes the carrier equation. A Nimitz or Ford must carry enough fuel, ordnance, and supplies to operate independently for months, thousands of miles, from the nearest friendly port. A Chinese carrier operates within range of shore-based air cover, land-based anti-ship missiles, and a logistics chain that stretches back to the Chinese mainland, the largest shipbuilding infrastructure on the planet. The Fujian displaces roughly 80,000 tons. It uses conventional propulsion, not nuclear. That limits its endurance and top speed compared to a Ford. But conventional propulsion also means it can be built in half the time, maintained by a much larger workforce, and replaced if lost in combat without a 7-year gap in the fleet. Most people assume China's carriers are technologically inferior across the board. The evidence tells a different story. The Fujian uses electromagnetic catapults, the same technology the Ford pioneered. China built its own version. Early reports suggest the Chinese EMALS variant actually has fewer reliability problems than the American original, precisely because the Chinese engineers watched what went wrong on the Ford and designed around those specific failure modes. I spent hours going through the open-source intelligence on Chinese carrier operations in 2025 and early 2026, and one detail kept nagging me: the tempo. China is not just building carriers. It is building carrier air wings, training carrier pilots, developing carrier doctrine, and integrating carriers into a joint force structure, all simultaneously, at a pace that suggests a deadline the public does not know about. Pentagon analysts calculated the production rate. China launched 2 carriers in 24 months. The United States, during the same period, was still trying to get the Ford's weapons elevators to pass acceptance testing on the second hull. The shipbuilding asymmetry is now the single most discussed metric in classified Navy briefings. Here is the take that will probably get us some pushback. The Ford class may be the most capable warship ever designed, and it may still be the wrong ship for this moment. Not because it is bad, because it is expensive, slow to build, and singular. In a war where the enemy's strategy is explicitly designed to neutralize your most valuable assets first, concentrating more capability into fewer hulls is not dominance. It is a vulnerability that looks like strength. What strikes us about this debate is that it mirrors almost exactly the battleship versus carrier argument of the 1930s. The admirals who built the Yamato believed that ultimate capability in a single hull was the path to victory. They were wrong. Not because the Yamato was weak, but because naval warfare had shifted to favor distributed lethality, numbers, and speed of replacement. The question is whether we are watching the same pattern repeat with different hardware. Now here's the complication. The answer is not as clean as build more cheap carriers. The United States tried that. It was called the Littoral Combat Ship Program. The Navy ordered 52 of them. They were supposed to be the affordable, modular, numerous alternative to expensive warships. The result was a fleet of ships that could not fight, could not survive, and cost far more than projected. By 2025, the Navy was decommissioning LCS hulls that were less than 10 years old. The lesson is brutal. Cheap does not automatically mean effective, and expensive does not automatically mean wasteful. The variable that actually matters is not cost per hull. It is combat capability delivered per dollar per year of service life. And that equation is genuinely difficult to calculate before you are in the war that tests it. What would you prioritize if you were making this call? 4 Ford-class supercarriers with technology that might change warfare in 2035, or 12 smaller carriers with proven systems that are ready to fight today? Think about that, because someone in the Pentagon is making exactly this decision right now. There is a third option gaining traction inside the Pentagon, and it is apparently what the leaked review recommended. Not Ford, not budget carriers, a hybrid fleet. The concept works like this. Keep the 2 Ford-class carriers already built. Complete the third. CVN-81, but redesign the fourth hull from the keel up as a smaller, more producible carrier, something in the 60,000-ton range, conventional propulsion, proven catapults, an air wing of 40 aircraft instead of 75, a build time of 4 years instead of 7, a cost of roughly $4 billion instead of 13. Run the numbers. For the price of the canceled fourth Ford-class hull, the Navy could build 3 of these mid-size carriers, 3 additional flight decks, 3 additional radar targets, 3 additional nodes in a distributed fleet that is inherently harder to neutralize than a single high-value unit. The math tells the story. A concentrated fleet of 4 supercarriers gives the enemy 4 targets. Eliminate 2, and you have removed 50% of America's carrier-based air power. A distributed fleet of 2 supercarriers plus 6 mid-size carriers gives the enemy 8 targets. Eliminate 2, and you have removed 25%. The attrition curve shifts significantly. But here is the obstacle nobody talks about: the shipbuilding industrial base. The United States has exactly 1 shipyard that can build nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. Huntington Ingalls Industries in Newport News, Virginia. 1 yard, 1 dry dock, 1 workforce trained in nuclear carrier construction. That workforce has been building Ford-class carriers for 20 years. Switching to a different design does not just mean new blueprints. It means retraining thousands of workers, retooling the yard, and accepting a production gap while the transition happens. China does not have this problem. China has multiple shipyards capable of building carriers at the same time. The Jiangnan Shipyard in Shanghai, the Dalian Shipyard. Both are larger than Newport News. Both are expanding. The infrastructure gap is as significant as the cost gap. And it is harder to fix because you cannot build a shipyard in 5 years. It takes a decade. President Trump floated a $65 billion shipbuilding package in early 2026 to address this. The proposal included funding for a second carrier-capable shipyard, accelerated construction of the Columbia-class submarine fleet, and a new class of frigates. Pentagon officials called it the most ambitious naval construction plan since the Reagan-era 600-ship Navy. But even with $65 billion, the United States cannot outbuild China in raw hull numbers. China's shipbuilding capacity is now roughly 200 times larger than America's by commercial tonnage output. 200 times. The deficit is not a gap. It is a chasm. This was not supposed to be the problem. For decades, the United States assumed that technological superiority would offset numerical inferiority. 1 Ford-class carrier was supposed to be worth 5 of anything an adversary could build. The weapons would be better. The aircraft would be more capable. The sailors would be better trained. All of that was true, until the adversary started closing the technology gap while keeping the numerical advantage. The Chinese J-35, the stealth fighter now operating from the Fujian's deck, is not an F-35C. It has a smaller radar cross-section than the J-15 it replaces, but it lacks the sensor fusion and networking capabilities of the American jet. One-on-one, the F-35C wins that fight decisively, but wars are not fought one-on-one. They are fought at scale. If China can put 300 carrier-based fighters in the air from 7 flight decks, and the United States can put 150 from 2, the qualitative edge has to overcome a 2-to-1 numerical disadvantage. Pentagon simulations show that at that ratio, losses on both sides become catastrophic. And the side that can replace aircraft and pilots faster gains a compounding advantage with every week the war continues. We do not worship the machine, we worship the equation. And the equation right now has too many variables pointing the wrong direction for the Ford-class program to be the only answer. Here is what the strategists inside the Pentagon are actually arguing. The Ford class is not the problem. The Ford class is a symptom. The real problem is that the United States has been building a navy optimized for power projection, for sailing across oceans to strike targets in permissive environments, while the adversary has been building a navy optimized for sea denial, for preventing the United States from operating within range of its shores. Power projection requires supercarriers. Sea denial requires missiles, submarines, mines, and swarm tactics, all of which are cheaper per unit than the platforms they target. The United States built the most powerful navy in history for a world where nobody could challenge it at sea. That world ended somewhere around 2020, and the $65 billion question, literally, is whether the Navy can adapt its fleet fast enough to fight the war it will actually face, not the war it spent 30 years preparing for. Here is the equation in its simplest form. The Ford class costs $13.3 billion and takes 7 years to build. A Chinese Type 003 costs roughly $2 billion and takes 2 years. Every year, the United States spends completing one Ford. China commissions 3 carriers. After a decade, the Ford fleet has grown by 1 hull. The Chinese carrier fleet has grown by 15. No amount of technology in a single hull overcomes those production numbers if the war lasts longer than 30 days. The leaked Pentagon review reportedly ended with a single recommendation, one sentence that sources described as the most consequential statement in American naval planning since the pivot to the Pacific. That sentence, according to 3 officials who read the document, was this: the Ford class should not be canceled, but it can no longer be the centerpiece of American naval strategy. Not the centerpiece, a component. One tool in a larger architecture that includes unmanned surface vessels, autonomous submarine hunters, long-range land-based missiles, and a distributed fleet of smaller, more numerous, more expendable platforms that can absorb losses and keep fighting. The real question is not whether the Ford class is a good ship. It is an extraordinary ship. The real question is whether the United States Navy can afford to build extraordinary ships one at a time when the adversary is building good enough ships 5 at a time. Subscribe to Navy Combat USA. Because what we just showed you is the equation nobody else is teaching. One final thought. The battleship admirals of 1940 loved their ships. The Yamato was a masterpiece. 72,000 tons of the most advanced naval engineering Japan could produce. 9 18-inch guns that could hit targets 26 miles away. Armor that could withstand any shell afloat. It was sunk by 300 aircraft launched from 11 carriers. Ships that cost a fraction of the Yamato's price and could be replaced in 18 months. The question is not whether the Ford class is the Yamato. The question is whether anyone in the Pentagon is honest enough to ask that out loud. Someone just did. The review is on the table, the budget request is on the hill, and the clock is running. China launched its 4th carrier this year. The 5th is under construction. The 6th has reportedly been approved. The United States has not laid the keel on the 3rd Ford. Will the U.S. Navy adapt its fleet before the numbers become irreversible? Comment yes or no. We read every response. Subscribe to Navy Combat USA, because the equation is changing, and the next video will show you what happens when it tips.